The material for week 12 is important, but in my view, the way it's being presented in all of the other labs is simply not the best way to present it. So for that reason, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I recognize that it's a little bit late, but the good news is that the due date is pushed back, and I think the way we will do it here, you'll find it to be much easier. Certainly, I think less frustrating. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave all of the regular assignments. I will put links to those on the web page. You can keep those for your files. We won't follow those guidelines, those instructions and whatnot as the other sections are. We're going to do our own thing. What we're going to do instead is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about habitat selection, and then we will use the data that the rest of the students are working with in the other sections, and I'll show you how to analyze those data. Now, they're going to analyze them incorrectly, and that's one of the reasons I don't want to do what they're doing. So we will analyze them a little bit differently. And then in a short lecture, I'm going to talk about a couple of examples for two species that I'm particularly interested in. And we'll see how all of that ties together. And that, I think, will set you up nicely for the material that comes next week. So the week 13 material will show up later this weekend. This material is officially the material for week 12. We're going to push the due date for this material all the way back to a week from Sunday. So it will be due at the same time that the week 13 material is due. And that gives me a chance to get caught up on my grading, as I'm sure you realize I'm just a little bit behind on that. All right, so first things first, the assignment requires you to do a statistical analysis, and depending on what version of Excel you have, that's either pretty straightforward or it's a little bit more complicated. If you have the Office 365 suite that you've downloaded from CMO, then it's going to be a little bit more challenging. You have to know a little bit more about statistics in order to really do it in Excel. So for that reason, we're going to use a different software program to do this statistical analysis. And I think you'll find this software program to be useful in the future as well, regardless of what your field of study is or what course you're working in. The name of the program that I'd like you to download is called PAST, P-A-S-T, which stands for Paleontology and Stratigraphy. It's a software program that is freeware. It was written by a bunch of scientists at the Natural History Museum at the University of Oslo in Norway. It's a little bit buried on their website simply because they developed so much software, and this program has been around for a while, although the version that's available was just recently updated. So when you go into Google, do what I've done here on this, on the Google search bar, just type in PAST or program PAST download. And the website that you're looking for is this one right here, PAST space 4, the past of the future. It's a clever little phrase. Okay, Natural History Museum. And if you look at the web address, look up here, it's www.nhm, which stands for Natural History Museum, .uio, which is University something Oslo, and then Norway. Okay, so that website is available in all different languages. Yours will probably default to English. But just click on that link, and that then takes you to this program. And this is the icon that you're looking for, this Nautilus shell, which is laying on its side. And then you can just scroll down here to the downloads. And what you want to do is download version 4.05. So just simply click on that, And what will happen then is that you get this little zip file opening up on the lower left-hand side of your screen, presumably on yours, just like it is on mine. And then click on that, and that should then unzip the program and you'll be ready to go. So what I'm going to do next is show you how to use that program. Let's make sure we can get this downloaded. Okay, so it's now in my downloads file. Okay, and all you have to do, I'm going to move this thing over to my other monitor like this. There we go. I'm just going to click on that, and it didn't like that. Okay, well, we're going to run that application, and I'll show you how that goes in just a moment. Okay, so I've installed the program. And by the way, if you're using a Macintosh, this isn't going to work. I'm pretty certain, you may double check the website, but I'm pretty certain that it only operates on Windows-based machines. So if you have a Windows emulator on your Macintosh, it'll work. Otherwise, perhaps not. If that's the case, then go ahead and try and run this in Excel, and if not, then will come and talk to me or send me an email, and we'll figure out a different way to analyze the data for you. It may be that in Macintosh there are some Mac-specific programs that allow you to do this. It's not difficult. All right, so we now have program passed open, and you'll notice that it looks very much like a spreadsheet, just like Excel. And there's this menu bar up at the top, and a whole host of different statistical procedures that you can run, and we're just going to use one of those. So let's go ahead and take the data that's provided in the exercise 12. Let's open that up and see what those data look like. So this is in the Excel file, which is available on one of the buttons under week 12. And these are data for isopterans. These are the pill bugs, or the little roly-polies. I think they're sometimes called colloquially. And I've not read all the specifics, but they were apparently offered a selection of two different habitat types, one that's dry and one that's moist. And then the number of pill bugs that was occupying each habitat was then counted, and that was done over 23 time intervals. So here you have 23 different replicates, and you have all of these different selection or numbers recorded here. So the nice thing about this data set is, from a statistical perspective, we say that it's balanced. That is, there are the same number of observations in each sample, and it's a reasonable sample size. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to copy these data into past. So I'm going to go back over here to past, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this button over here that says column attributes. Just click on that, and then click on where it says name here. I'm just going to click inside there, and I'm going to just type in dry. So now I have a column that's labeled dry. Hit the tab button and then call this one moist. Okay, so I can now go here and unclick the column attributes. And now I'm just going to highlight over in Excel my two columns of data. And I've got them highlighted. I'm now just going to press Control-C to copy them, and you'll see the little dashed line goes around all of those points. Come back over here to past and put my cursor in this square right there, and then hit Control-V. And there now are all of my data. So I can now close Microsoft Excel. I'll minimize it, and I'll just increase that. All right, so in the exercise that everyone else is doing, they're using a statistical test called the chi-square. And the thing about the chi-square test is it is a goodness of fit test. That is, it evaluates a distribution with a theoretical distribution or an observed distribution with a known distribution. And that really doesn't fit what we're doing here. We really don't have a theoretical expectation about what is supposed to happen here. So for that reason, the chi-square test is inappropriate. So what we're going to do instead is a simple t-test. And you can do that in Excel. And I will have a link for you under week 12, which guides you through doing that in Excel. Of course, that won't work if you have the Office 365. So we're going to do the t-test here. And what I'm going to do is I simply leave this first square highlighted like that. And I now take my cursor and drop it down to this square at the bottom. And I'm going to first hit the Shift key, and then I'm going to hit the left mouse button. All right, if you do it in any other sequence, these observations won't be highlighted. So that's one of the quirks of having freeware software, is that sometimes it's not quite as user-friendly as other programs might be. So we've now highlighted the data. And we now want to choose the statistical test that we want to use. And we're going to use up here under Univariate. We're going to click the Univariate tab. And we're going to do a two-sample test. And then it gives us a whole host of possible two-sample tests. So when you look at this list, notice there's the center one is called a two-sample paired test. That's not what we're doing. And we could do an F and T test using parameters, and we are doing a parametric test, but that's not the option we want. We want this very first option right here, so we're going to click on that. And it now very quickly gives us this result. So here under the dry habitat, and notice up here the tab, it says t-test. There are all these other tests up here as well. Some of these are referred to as non-parametric tests and so on. We're using this first one, students t-test. That's the one for us. So here it gives us n, which is the sample size. There were 23 observations under dry and 23 under moist. The average number of pill bugs in the dry habitat was 2.9. And the average number under the moist habitat was 12.9. So it seems pretty clear that the sow bugs or the pill bugs were preferentially using the moist habitat. And it then gives us the 95% confidence intervals for those means. What that tells us is that we're 95% sure that our estimated mean, over here in the dry case, it's 2.913, we're 95% sure that the true value is somewhere between 1.6 and 4.1. And for the moist habitats, we're 95% sure that it's somewhere between 11.67 and 14.156. So the 1.6 and the 4.1, those are the limits of our confidence for the mean. And here, the 11.6 and the 14.1, those are the limits of our confidence for the moist habitat. Notice that those confidence intervals are not overlapping. All right? So you are either in the moist group or you are in the dry group. There is no overlap between those. So we're pretty certain that these are different. Okay? Now it gives us the computed t, which is 11.668, and when you do a t-test, you're going to compare that computed value with the value in a table, depending on what your desired probability of correctness is. As a default in biology, we want to be right 95% of the time, so we say that our alpha value is going to be 0.05. So that also means we're willing to be wrong 5% of the time. So here you see p is equal to 0.05. In other words, the probability of being wrong if we make this decision is 5%. Okay, so there the critical tabled value is 2.0154. Our value is 11.668. It far exceeds that value. So it's way beyond that, which then means that in fact our two samples are different. Okay, now it gives us some other options here that we don't have to worry about. We're making an assumption that our variances in the two samples are equal. That's the sort of thing you're going to have to worry about when you're doing higher level statistics, or if you're working on a different scenario. For our purposes, this is the one that we want. So we now know that there is a difference between these two groups, okay? And it seems pretty clear based on these values right here that they are different. Okay, so let's go ahead and close. Oh, well, before I close it, I will make one point. You can click on this copy button here and then paste this table in a Word document. So if in the future you're doing this for an assignment, you can simply click on that copy button, paste it, and you are good to go. All right, let's close this then, and let's go over here and select the Plot tab. And what we want to do is make a bar chart box plot using our data, and we can click on that, and that now gives this nice little graph. This is a bar graph. So here's the moist habitat and here's the dry habitat, and this axis over here is number of pill bugs. And these error bars right here, those are the standard error bars. And you see that clearly the sow bugs, the pill bugs, the isopterans are using the moist habitat preferentially over the dry habitat. So you can then change this to what's called a box plot. We can talk about that at some other time. You'll certainly be introduced to box plots in other courses, but it gives you a little bit more information. For our purposes, this graph is just fine. And of course, you can copy this graph and paste it in a Word document. You can put in labels and so on under graph settings here. You can change the font size and the symbol size and all of that sort of stuff. And you can put in a label for the x-axis and the y-axis. So all those things are available to you. And then you can save it. You can change the color scheme, and you can save it as any host of different file formats, as a JPEG or a bitmap or a TIFF or whatever. If you save it as SVG, that stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. And that means, if you save it as that means you can enlarge this thing to enormous proportions. You can make it billboard sized, and it will still have the crystal clarity of this little graph right here. All right, so that in a nutshell was the assignment for week 12 that all the other students are doing. Of course, you would have to read through all the instructions and all of that sort of stuff, and to do that, and that would take you several hours to work through all of that. We've now worked through it in just a matter of minutes. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to move on, and I'm going to talk just a little bit about habitat selection in a different group of organisms. So I'm going to close all of this stuff out, and then see you in just a moment to talk about habitat selection. Okay, so what I want to do now is talk about it's labeled optimality and tolerance limits, but we're really talking about habitat selection. So more about that in just a few moments. What you should do, there is another button under week 12, which is basically a jot form that I'd like you to work on as we go through here, so that by the time you're done with this lecture, you will have completed your assignment. Okay, so that should make your life pretty easy. So as we go along, answer the questions on the jot form. You can open that up and be ready to go. All right, so optimality and tolerance. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that all organisms have their highest fitness, their highest inclusive fitness under certain conditions. What do I mean by fitness? I mean an organism's ability to survive and reproduce. So organisms that live longer and reproduce more often are said to have higher fitness than those that don't. Okay, so the key is how much do you reproduce and how long do you live? With reproduction being the key. Not you can produce lots of offspring in a very short time and have very high fitness, or live a very long time and produce no offspring, and that's very low fitness. So it really comes down to how many offspring do you produce. So the other point here is tolerance limits, and what I mean by tolerance limits is this. There are some conditions which you simply can't tolerate. So if you think about people, before the invention of clothing or before people discovered furs, we were totally restricted in our use of habitat to Africa and essentially towards sub-Saharan, tropical and subtropical Africa. And it wasn't until we figured out clothing and skins and things of that sort that we were able to leave that environment and go elsewhere. If you think about it now and think about where people live, most people live in tropical or subtropical environments. Relatively few people live in the Arctic. And those that do live in the Arctic rely on all sorts of technology and so on. If you think about the North American Indians, the Inuits obviously were living above the Arctic Circle and still live there. And they are a pretty hardy folk. They're not like you and I. They tend to have more robust bodies. They carry more body fat, and they have changed their behavior in a way that makes it possible for them to survive under those conditions. We would not make it under those conditions without the help of a great deal of technology. So that idea of tolerance limits, it simply means that beyond some environmental condition, you can no longer make it. You can no longer survive. You can no longer reproduce, whatever it happens to be. Okay? Alrighty. See if I can get this. There we go. All right. So what we want to do is think in terms of something called the niche. I guess if you're speaking the Queen's English, it would be niche. If you're an American, you'll just say niche. But the niche can be defined as where an organism lives and what an organism does. That definition is very vague. It has changed over the years. Jonathan Roughgarden, when he was at Stanford, his doctoral dissertation, which was completed at Harvard, was a mathematical treatment and definition of the niche. And that's far beyond our abilities in this course to deal with. But for our purposes, and in general for most biologists, we simply think of the niche as where an organism lives and what it does. And by where it lives, I don't mean your street address. I mean what habitat, what environmental conditions are you living under. Okay, so it's a vague description, but it's the one that we'll have to do for the moment. Okay, as an example, let's talk about some rather cool animals, and those are the southern flying squirrels. They are in the genus Glaucomes and the species Glaucomes volans. So if you took Latin when you were in high school, glauco refers to gray. MYS is Latin for mouse. And then volans refers to flight or flying. So Glaucomes volans is the gray mouse that flies. Okay, it's not a mouse, it's a squirrel. And these animals are in the hardwood deciduous forests of North America. And there are some populations in Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras as well. So they occupy hardwood deciduous forests from just into Canada all the way down into Guatemala and Honduras. They are here in our area. If you go out to Juden Creek, the conservation area, there are southern flying squirrels all over the place there. It's a you generally don't see them because they're active at night rather than the day. So part of their niche would be the fact that they are nocturnal. Southern flying squirrels are hard mass specialists. That is, they eat acorns and hickory nuts. They will also eat bird eggs and baby birds and any free food that comes along, but they persist primarily off what we call hard mast. And now, when the maple trees are producing their seeds, they'll certainly eat those maple seeds, but the way they get through the winter is by stashing large quantities of acorns, hickory nuts, pecans, and things of that sort. Okay, so one question that pops up is how did these populations of flying squirrels get to Guatemala and Mexico? Okay, because those populations are completely allopatric with any other Glaucomys volans populations. Between Florida and between the hardwood deciduous forests of Louisiana and so on, and even the hardwood deciduous forests of Texas, between there and Guatemala, there is an awful lot of desert. If you've ever been down to Big Bend National Park, you have an appreciation for what the Chihuahuan Desert can be like. So it's pretty clear that the Glaucomys volans didn't walk down there, and they certainly didn't fly down there. So the question is, how did they get there? Now, I suppose it's entirely possible that God, in his or her almighty wisdom, decided just to put them there, but that seems unlikely. The fact is that we know that these animals down there are distinct genetically, so they are completely allopatric. They are distinct genetically, and we can recognize them as different subspecies. So the question is, how did they get there? And the answer has to do with what's happened in the past. At one point, if you've ever been driven along Interstate 70 and crossed the Missouri River numerous times, you'll notice that on the south side of the Missouri River, that's where you have the Ozarks and all of the mountainous, quote-unquote mountainous habitat that we have in Missouri. And north of the Missouri River is what's referred to as the glaciated plains. So millions of years ago, back in the Pleistocene, there was a glacier that extended all the way down into Missouri, and the southern tip of that glacier ended where the Missouri River is right now. So as that glacier came down, right, it's a lot of ice. Obviously, the climate in Missouri then was very different than it is right now. And what that means is that the habitat that we have here wasn't hardwood deciduous forest. Instead, it was trees that are associated with those colder, moister sorts of habitats, and those would be spruce trees, so pine trees and spruce trees. So this area would have been dominated then by blue spruce and white spruce and black spruce, and hemlock and all of those different sorts of trees, the sorts of trees that you associate with northern climates or high altitudes. That's what would have dominated here. And the hardwood deciduous forest that we have here now would have extended much farther south. In fact, they extended all the way down into Mexico and Honduras and Guatemala. So what happened is the habitat that's occupied by these flying squirrels has shifted. Now, the flying squirrels themselves, flying squirrels evolved not in North America, but they evolved in Asia. In fact, in Nepal, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, around the Himalayas, that's where the center of evolution for gliding mammals is. That's where all the other species of flying squirrels are. And the parent species for Glaucomys is a species called Eoglaucomys. And about 30 million years ago, the genus Glaucomys split off from Eoglaucomys and managed to get across the Bering Strait, the Bering Land Bridge, across Beringia into Alaska, and then south from there into the United States. And the southern part of that range extension included Glaucomys volans, and that's the one that we have down here. So they made it all the way down into Mexico, living in these hardwood deciduous forests, eating hard mass oaks, so acorns, hickory nuts, walnuts, pecans, things of that sort. They live in cavities in dead trees, so in snags, and they glide from tree to tree. Okay. So in order to reproduce, these guys have to have a nest cavity. In order to get through the winter, they have to be able to store up an adequate supply of nuts. And they have a high energy lifestyle, so they need a diet, a food source that has a lot of calories. And certainly hickory nuts and acorns provide that food source. They are not capable of hibernation. Okay, they can enter a mild torpor, but they cannot hibernate. Hibernation means you are able to drop your body temperature all the way down to 4 degrees centigrade and not lower. And then at the end of the hibernation cycle, you elevate your body temperature back up to 37 degrees centigrade. These guys are unable to do that. They can drop their body temperature a few degrees, and when animals do that, we call it torpor rather than hibernation. So, for example, grizzly bears do not hibernate, nor do black bears. They can't. If a grizzly bear were to drop its body temperature down to 4 degrees centigrade, at the end of the winter, it would take about 2 to 3 tons worth of fat in terms of energy for it to bring its body temperature back up to 37 degrees. And clearly they can't store that much fat. So grizzly bears, they enter torpor. They do not hibernate. Okay, so we know that the flying squirrels came from Asia. There is a different species here in North America as well, and that's Glaucomys sabrinus, and both sabrinus and volans. And we don't know when they speciated, whether they speciated once they got here or before, but they got here somewhere between 5 million and 20 million years ago. So how did they get to Mexico? Well, they followed the habitat. So it turns out that sabrinus occupies a different kind of habitat, and I'll show you a map that illustrates that in just a few moments. Glaucomys sabrinus occupies spruce habitats, so high elevation, cooler kinds of habitats. And it doesn't eat acorns, and I mean, it will if they're available, but instead of eating acorns, it's eating truffles. It's a truffle specialist. So it comes down to the forest floor, and it digs up these truffles. The truffles are a mycorrhizal fungus that is associated with the roots of hemlocks and spruce trees. And it's those truffles are important for nitrogen fixation by the spruce and the hemlock trees. So in order to capture nitrogen, which they need for protein synthesis and all of that sort of stuff, those trees have to have these truffles associated with the roots. And what the northern flying squirrels do is they dig up those truffles, eat them, and then when they poop out the spores from the truffles. So they are serving to distribute the spores for the truffles in the forest. And for that reason, we refer to Glaucomys sabrinus, the northern flying squirrel, as a keystone species. That is, without the northern flying squirrels, those coniferous forests degrade. So they are a critical component of those forests to keep them healthy. So how did the flying squirrels get to the southern flying squirrels get to Mexico? They followed the forested habitat as it headed south with the advancing glacier. They don't fly across open areas, although there is one report by Jim Findlay from back in the 50s where he found a flying squirrel impaled on a barbed wire fence in the middle of a meadow. But aside from that, these guys simply don't cross open areas. They glide from tree to tree. So they're totally restricted to the forest. So the forest, as this glacier advanced over a long period of time, would have moved south. And of course, when the glacier retreated and the climate changed, the hardwood deciduous forest moved north. So first it moved south, and then with a glacial retreat, those forests move north again. But if you think about it, when you're in a habitat, if you want to get to a cooler habitat, you go up in elevation or you go north. And if you've ever been out west, you realize that, right? If you're in Southern California and you want to be in the ponderosa pine forest, you have to either go up in elevation or you have to go farther north. So going up or going north results in moister, cooler sorts of habitats. So as these hardwood deciduous forests retreated northward, right, with the retreating glacier, the oak, the hardwood deciduous forest, would have gone north, but some of those hardwood deciduous forests would have gone up in elevation. And where you find the flying squirrels in Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras now is on the tops of mountains, where you have these small pockets of hardwood deciduous forest. And those mountain tops with the hardwood deciduous forest are completely surrounded by desert. So the flying squirrels have become trapped on top of these mountain tops. All right. We've done all of that. That brings up another important point, okay? And that has to do with the gentleman you see here on the right. This is C. Hart Merriam, Clinton Hart Merriam, who was actually, he began his professional career as a physician, but his real interest was in vertebrate biology, and he was one of the founders of the American Ornithologist Union, and he is also considered the father of the American Society of Mammalogists. He was responsible for a lot of faunistic surveys that were done out west. All of his field notebooks are deposited at the Anthropology Museum at Berkeley. He spent much of his life studying the North American Indians and all of the different tribes and trying to understand their languages and their customs and all of that sort of stuff. But at any rate, one of the things that C. Hart Merriam recognized were these things that we now refer to as life zones. So when we talk about the hardwood deciduous forest, that's a term that was coined by C. Hart Merriam. So he recognized these different kinds of habitats. Coniferous forest, the sagebrush scrub, the Mojave Desert, which is basically a creosote scrub, the Sonoran Desert, which is basically dominated by a saguaro cactus, the chaparral, which is not a habitat that we have out here. It's a western habitat on the coast of California. So he identified all of these different habitat types, these life zones, right? And he recognized that these habitats were different. And that's important because all of these different quote-unquote life zones have different species associated with them. So rather than talking about these pill bugs liking a moist habitat or a dry habitat, right? I mean, C. Hart Merriam recognized that, for example, southern flying squirrels are associated with hardwood deciduous forest, that is their habitat type, right? Their habitat selection, and the northern flying squirrels are associated with coniferous forest. So he's the sort of the father of this whole idea about life zones and habitat selection. We've done all of that. Let's look just very quickly then at a map of Glaucomys, the distribution of Glaucomys sabrinus and Glaucomys volans. And let's see if we can kind of understand what's going on in terms of habitat selection. These two species look very similar. Let me show you these photographs right here. The animal on the right is a southern flying squirrel. And if you look at this animal, you notice that it has that nice dark margin across its wing. They have these flaps of skin which stretch from their wrists all the way back to their ankles. That's called the patagium. And they have a little cartilage projecting out from the wrist that when they when they glide, it sticks out like a wingtip. You can see that over here on this animal. The little cartilage is projecting the wing out. It's like a stall tip, STOLL tip on a Boeing 737. Okay. So here, the other cool thing compared to non-squirrels, notice what he's doing with his back foot. He can rotate his back foot 180 degrees. Other animals can't do that. Okay, so this is the southern flying squirrel. They weigh about 70 grams or so. This over here is a northern flying squirrel. Weighs, the smallest ones are about 120 grams. And in Idaho, they get up to about 220 grams. We've had some animals in the lab that were as heavy as 320 grams. So they can get quite large. And here, this animal is coming into land. This is a stroboscopic photograph. So this is the same animal, just a fraction of a second later. But here you can see that patagium, that wing membrane stretched out as he's parachuting in for his landing on the tree trunk. And this is what they look like when they glide. This animal is just taken off. This is a southern flying squirrel up here. This is a northern down here. So the tail is shaped like a nice flat feather. And then they stretch out those patagia and then they glide. They're pretty cool. Whoops. I lost it. Let's go down. Okay, so let's look at this distribution map then. So notice where the northern flying squirrel is. The northern flying squirrel is all the way from Alaska, all the way across Canada, right? Gets down into New England like this, gets into Michigan, Wisconsin, okay? Comes into Idaho, and this is where the biggest flying squirrels are down in here. Also gets here, right, into these mountains in Utah. There's also a population, and the speck is too small to see on this map. There's in the San Bernardino Mountains of California, there is a population of northern flying squirrels. And they've obviously been trapped there since the last glacial advance. So that's, what is it? That's probably 1,000, maybe 2,000 miles from there to the next across this way in southern Utah, it's, maybe 800 miles, something like that. So that's quite some distance. Notice also that there are northern flying squirrels here in the Appalachian Mountains. Well, these guys are on mountain tops, so at the high elevation peaks of the Appalachians, right, that's where the northern flying squirrels are. That's where the coniferous trees are. And then here, if you look over here towards Wyoming and South Dakota, those are the Black Hills of South Dakota. There too you have coniferous forests, and there too you have northern flying squirrels. Notice they're isolated. They didn't walk there. They got there when these habitats were connected. So if you're asking where are the northern flying squirrels, an equal question or an equivalent question would be where are the coniferous forests, because that's where the flying squirrels are. Obviously the exception are the Rockies, except for this stuff right in here, right? Because there are no northern flying squirrels in Colorado. Okay, there are no northern flying squirrels in New Mexico, even though the Rockies extend that far. So it's not just the presence of coniferous forest. You have to have these truffles. Without the truffles, you're not going to have northern flying squirrels. So for northern flying squirrels, if you want to define the niche or you want to talk about its habitat selection, the key component is going to be coniferous forests, relatively cool temperatures, okay, and the presence of truffles. Over here on the right-hand side, we can look at where the southern flying squirrel is. And you see here, it gets all the way down into Mexico and all the way down into Guatemala and Honduras, okay? These isolated populations. At one time, that was all hardwood deciduous forest. When the glacier advanced all the way down here like this, okay, that hardwood deciduous forest was pushed down here. When the glacier advanced, when it retreated, right, when it came back and went farther north, these guys got trapped down here. So if you want to talk about the distribution of southern flying squirrels, their habitat is defined by the presence of oaks, hickories, pecans. Okay, it's that simple. So northern and southern flying squirrels don't really overlap much at all. The only place where they really overlap is here in the Appalachians, where the southern flying squirrels are at lower elevations, the northern flying squirrels at higher elevations. So even there, their habitat choices differ, right? Their niches are different. One sad consequence of all of this is that with climate change, the distribution of northern flying squirrels is going north, and the southern flying squirrels are moving north as well. And in fact, the populations of the northern flying squirrels here in the Appalachians are critically endangered because, as a consequence of climate change. So it's more probable than not that by the time you are in your 50s or 60s, that these populations of northern flying squirrels will be extinct. Okay, they won't be there anymore. And that whole area will then be dominated by southern flying squirrels. The southern flying squirrels, in fact, have now made it up into this portion of Canada, so around Ontario and all of that. That's all southern flying squirrels now. The northern flying squirrels have retreated farther north. So that's just one of the consequences of climate change. Okay, so that's our discussion of habitat selection. If you've been following along with the jot form, we should have answered every question that I had there. So the questions were, what is a niche? Southern flying squirrels occupy which kind of habitat? Northern flying squirrels occupy which kind of habitat? Oh, we didn't talk about allopatry and sympatry. Allopatry is when the ranges of two species do not overlap. Okay, when two species are in sympatry, then their ranges do overlap. Southern flying squirrels eat acorns, hickory nuts, and pecans, and whatever else they can find. Northern flying squirrels eat primarily truffles and other stuff that they can find, right? But they specialize on truffles. Do flying squirrels hibernate? No, they don't. They are able to go into torpor. Where do they come from ultimately in an evolutionary sense? They come from Asia, right? So their parent species is Eoglaucomes fimbriatus. And then who's responsible for the whole concept of life zones? Life zones, that would be C. Hart Merriam. So those are the questions that you need for your jot form. That's it, kids. You're done. All right. That's all she wrote.